The morning I found that pine felled clean across the washed-out section of trail, I stood there for a long time before I could make sense of what I was looking at. Long enough that Pepper circled back from wherever she'd gone ahead and sat down beside my left boot, watching my face the way she did when something had shifted in me that she'd registered before I did. The trail dropped about 2 feet into a mud channel there, a slump from the September rains, and the pine bridged it as precise as any timber crew could have laid it. Bark side up, root plate resting in the soft shoulder, the crown nested into the uphill bank. I'd marked that tree myself. Orange blaze on the north face, waist high, same as always. The blaze was still there on the side of the trunk facing the sky. I'm going to need to back up and explain some things before that moment makes the kind of sense it made to me. My wife, Ruth, died in October, 2 years before the morning I'm describing. Pancreatic cancer, which moves the way it moves, and I won't go into that part except to say we had about 3 months from diagnosis to the end, and I was there for all of it. And then she was gone and I was not. Not really. I went through the work of living the same way a pump goes through the motions when the pressure line is cracked. The function is technically happening, but nothing is arriving where it's supposed to. I'm a forest pathologist by trade. I've worked independently for most of my career, taking marking contracts with state agencies and timber companies across the Pacific Northwest, walking timber and flagging diseased trees for removal so that the healthy ones can have room to grow. It's solitary work, which I always appreciated, and in the 2 years after Ruth's death, it became the kind of solitary work that is less a preference and more a necessity. I could not hold a conversation in those years without something behind my sternum closing down tight around the 3rd or 4th sentence. It wasn't grief exactly, or not grief as other people seem to mean the word. It was more like a permanent recalibration of what things cost. Everything took more than it used to. People took the most. My daughter Clara is the one who suffered most from that accounting. Clara had her own grief and her own way of carrying it, and the two of us handled Ruth's funeral the way 2 people handle a heavy piece of furniture through a narrow door. Necessary cooperation, no warmth, no ease, and both of us relieved when it was over and we could set the thing down. She called twice in the month after. I answered once, badly. After that, the phone stayed quiet from her end and I didn't reach for it from mine, and 2 years went by the way a season goes by when you're not watching it, in the peripheral vision of days that are mostly the same. I took the Cascades Foothills marking contract in September of that 2nd year. 6 weeks of work on a mixed timber stand northeast of a small town called Ridgemont, where a beetle infestation had moved through a section of ponderosa and lodgepole and left behind a patchwork of standing dead and dying trees that needed to come out before they became a fire hazard or a trail liability. The agency managing the trail system had a recreational corridor running through the south end of the stand, and my job was to blaze the trees that could go, document the progression of the infestation, and flag anything that posed an immediate risk to trail users. 6 weeks was the contracted duration. The pay was enough to carry me through winter, and the work was the kind I could do with most of my mind left over for the quiet. I brought Pepper because I always brought Pepper. She was 8 years old that fall, a black and tan hound with one ear that had never quite achieved its full ambition, and folded forward at the tip like a page corner turned down. She'd worked timber with me since she was 18 months old, and she understood the basic vocabulary of the job. Stay close, in dense brush, range ahead on open trail, come in at the sound of my wooden marking mallet. She was not a hunting dog in any active sense anymore. Mostly she walked the days alongside me and slept at my feet in the camp trailer at night, and made the silence feel chosen rather than imposed. Ruth had loved one spot on the trail system in particular. She'd hiked that corridor the previous October, before the diagnosis, before anything we knew was coming. And she'd sent me a photograph from Trail Post 7, a weathered fiberglass marker stake set at a bend in the trail where the ridge opened west, and you could see 3 ridgelines stacked pale and blue in the afternoon light. She'd written on the back of the printed photograph — she still printed photographs — just this: "You would have liked this one." She was right. I would have. The first week of the contract, I found Trail Post 7 during my initial survey walk. It was exactly where the photograph said it would be. The ridge view intact. The same pale stack of timber country going west toward the coast range. I stood there about as long as it took me to understand that I was going to stand there every day I was on that trail. And on the way back to the truck, I pulled a small stem of western red cedar from a low branch by the path. The kind of stem maybe 8 inches long with flat sprays of scale-like leaves, and I laid it at the base of the post. I didn't plan that gesture. It happened the way certain things happen when you've been carrying something long enough. Not as a decision, but as a physical necessity. The body doing what the mind has been too stubborn to allow. I left a cedar sprig at Post 7 every morning after that, before I started marking. It took 30 seconds. I never said anything. It wasn't that kind of ritual. I'd lay the stem at the base of the post, look west at those ridgelines for a moment, and then go to work. Pepper came with me every morning to Post 7, and she never once showed particular interest in the ritual itself. She'd range ahead down the trail or sit watching something in the timber with the calm, uncomplicated attention of a dog who has decided that this is simply a part of how mornings work. The first week of marking went by without event. I documented 43 trees as candidates for removal, 17 of them flagged for priority clearing due to their proximity to the trail corridor. The infestation pattern was what I'd been told to expect. Beetle galleries concentrated in the thicker-barked older trees, the younger trees largely unaffected, the dying trees easy to read once you knew what to look for. The crown going grey-green from the top down, the bark plated with pitch tubes where the tree had tried to fight back and failed. I'd been reading these trees for 30 years. They told me what they had left in them in a language of colour and texture and bark condition that had become as automatic as reading a word on a page. If you've followed along this far and you're wondering why a man with that kind of working knowledge of the natural world would eventually find himself standing at the edge of a trail in October with no rational explanation for what he was looking at, I understand. I had the same question. I'm still working on the answer. Leave a comment if you've been somewhere that quietly refused to be explained, because I don't think I'm the only one. The second week of the contract was when Pepper started behaving differently on the east slope. The east slope was the steepest section of my marking territory, a long pitch of mixed timber dropping from the ridgeline down toward a creek drainage. The soil up there was thin over a layer of fractured basalt, and the trees grew with a particular lean toward the light, most of them angled slightly downhill, the root plates on the uphill side pronounced and thick. There was a stand of ponderosa in the upper third of the slope that the beetle had hit hard, a cluster of maybe 9 or 10 trees showing advanced mortality, and I was working through them systematically that second week. Pepper had always ranged ahead on the east slope without hesitation. On the 4th day of the second week, she stopped at a point about 60 feet upslope from where I was working and stood facing the timber above the stand, motionless. Her nose was up and working. Her tail was level, not tucked, not raised in the way she carried it when she was alert to a threat. Just held still, horizontal, and she was reading something in the air above the dead ponderosa that I could not read from where I stood. "Pepper," I said, not loudly. She flicked one ear back at the sound of my voice, and then returned her full attention to whatever she was watching. I looked upslope. The timber was dense above the ponderosa stand, hemlock and younger fir, shadow and shade between the trunks. Nothing moved. There was no wind on that slope in the morning hours, the air still and cool, and carrying the clean smell of the pitch from the trees I'd been working around. I heard a stellar jay somewhere in the canopy above me, and then I didn't. And after a moment I noticed that the general background sound of the slope, the small movement of birds and squirrels, and the distant creek had gone quieter than it should have been for that hour of the day. I assumed a deer, maybe a bear working down from higher ground, which would explain the birds going quiet and Pepper's careful attention. I made a little noise with my boot on a stick and watched for movement in the timber above, and saw none. After a minute or two, the small sounds of the slope returned one by one, and Pepper walked back to me and sat down beside my knee, and I went back to work. It happened again the next morning. Same slope, different position, farther downhill. Pepper stopped at the edge of the ponderosa stand where the marked trees gave way to healthy timber, and stood there with her nose up and her tail exactly level for a long time, maybe 4 minutes, before she shook herself and came back. I made a note of it in my field log, the kind of note I would have made for any change in animal behavior that might indicate something relevant to my survey work. I wrote, "Dog alert twice, Upper East Slope, duration 3 to 4 minutes. No visual confirmation. Birds suppressed briefly, both occurrences." I put it with the rest of my field observations and didn't think too much more about it, because the rational explanation was still available to me. Something large was moving through the timber above the beetle stand, something that Pepper could smell and I couldn't see, and the birds knew about it before either of us did. That was a complete explanation. It fit everything I had observed. I was satisfied with it for about 3 more days. The third week of the contract brought the first real cold. Morning temperatures dropped into the low 30s, and the trail corridor held a light frost most mornings until 10 or 11. The yellowed needles of the dead ponderosa lacquered with it, the ground crunchy underfoot in the shadow sections. I was working the middle section of the east slope by then, the trees I'd identified in the first week that needed documentation before I could finalize the removal sequence for the agency. One of those trees was a ponderosa I'd blazed on day 4, a large specimen with a trunk diameter I'd measured at roughly 22 inches, standing at the edge of the trail corridor just above the section of trail that had washed out in September. I'd noted the washout in my initial survey. The September rains had carved a channel across the trail about 8 inches deep and 18 to 20 inches wide, sloping down to a low point where water still pooled after rain. Not impassable, but a tripping hazard, and the agency trail crew wasn't scheduled to address it until spring. I'd walked around it, or stepped across it every day for 2.5 weeks without particular thought. On the third Thursday of the contract, I came down the east slope on my standard morning route, and the washout was not there anymore. Or rather, the washout was exactly where it had always been, but bridging it was the 22-inch ponderosa I'd blazed, laid out flat, root plate settled into the soft bank on the uphill side, crown nested into the downhill shoulder, the bark side up and the crown angled to the trail grade, with the kind of placement you'd get from a crew that knew what they were doing. The orange marking blaze I'd put on the north face of that trunk faced straight up at the October sky. I stopped walking. Pepper walked past me, stepped up onto the trunk, walked its length, and stepped down on the other side. She looked back at me. She was not alarmed, she was waiting. I want to be clear about what I was thinking in that moment, because I know how this sounds, and I was aware of how it sounded even standing there on a cold October morning with no one else on the trail. I was thinking about equipment. I was thinking about what it would take to fell that tree and position it the way it was positioned, the stump cut clean and level in the way a chainsaw makes a cut. The trunk rolled and settled into the bank with enough force to seat it, but not enough to crumble the bank edge. I was thinking about whether a trail crew had come through unscheduled, working ahead of the spring timeline, and I was thinking about whether there was a vehicle access point anywhere on the east slope that could have brought a saw and a cable or a come-along. There was no such access. The east slope trailhead was 2 miles from any road capable of carrying the equipment you'd need, and the ground between was too steep and rooted for ATV work. I walked the full circumference of the stump. The cut was clean. A single pass with no secondary scoring, the wood pale and fresh at the centre, and barely beginning to oxidize at the surface. It had been cut recently, within the last 24 to 36 hours, I estimated, based on the oxidation pattern and the light pitch bleed at the cut face. The root plate impact point in the soft bank showed a single deposit, no rolling adjustment marks. Whatever had positioned that trunk had done it in one motion. I crouched there at the stump for a while, running my hand across the cut face. 22 inches of ponderosa is not a small tree. The trunk would weigh somewhere north of 400 pounds in the section between the stump and the first major limb, and more as a whole piece. I am not a small man, but I am not going to move 400 pounds of wet pine 1 inch without mechanical assistance. The rational explanation that had served me well since the second week of the contract was not serving me anymore. I stood up and looked down the trail at the felled trunk, at Pepper standing on the far side of it, looking back at me. I looked at the trail corridor stretching east into the timber, at the hemlock shadows beyond it, at the October light filtering cold and level through the canopy. There was no sound on the trail in either direction. The birds were doing what birds do, moving through the canopy overhead with the ordinary noise of an October morning. Nothing was suppressed. Nothing was watching, or nothing I could see. I walked the trunk's length carefully, checking the bark condition, checking the way the crown had been nested into the downhill bank. And that was when I saw the cedar sprig. It was lying across the top of the trunk about 2 feet from the uphill end, in the flat space between 2 branch stubs where the bark was smooth. It was a stem of western red cedar, the same species I'd been cutting for my morning ritual, and it was approximately the same size as the stems I cut, maybe 7 or 8 inches, with the same flat spray of scale leaves. It was fresh. The cut end was pale, not dried. Someone or something had cut it within the last day, the same way I cut mine every morning by pulling a small stem from a low branch. I stood there looking at it for a long time. I want to tell you what that felt like, and I find that I don't have the language for it that I'm satisfied with. I've been looking for the right language since October of that year, and I haven't found it, so I'll say what I can. It felt like being caught doing something private. Not in a shameful way. The way you feel when someone who loves you notices a habit you've developed without telling anyone, and the noticing is gentle, and you understand from the gentleness that they've been paying attention longer than you knew. I set my marking mallet down on the trunk and I sat on the bark beside the cedar sprig, and I didn't do much of anything for about 10 minutes. Pepper jumped up onto the trunk and laid down beside me with her chin on my thigh, which she did sometimes in the evenings but rarely in the middle of a work morning. The cold light moved through the hemlock canopy above us. Some cloud came in from the west, and the light changed from pale gold to flat grey, and then back again. After a while I picked the cedar sprig up and held it and looked at it. The scale leaves were still pliable, still carrying the faint, clean smell that cedar has in the morning when the air is damp. I placed it back where it had been. I picked up my mallet and I went back to work. and I said nothing to anyone about what I'd found. The day after I found the cedar sprig on the trunk, I came down the east slope on my morning route and stopped about 40 yards above the felled tree. I stopped because Pepper stopped, and she stopped with a different quality than she'd used on the upper slope for the past week and a half. She was not ranging ahead. She was standing at my left side with her shoulder touching my calf. Her nose pointed toward the tree line west of the trail corridor. And she was entirely still, not the interested stillness of a hunting dog reading a scent, but something more like the composure of an animal that has already understood what it's dealing with and made its peace with it. I followed her nose line to the tree line. The light was at the end of the afternoon by then, the sun already behind the ridgeline to the west, and the sky going from pale blue to a kind of hammered pewter at the horizon. The hemlock and fir along the west side of the trail corridor were in full shadow, the trunks dark, and for a moment I saw nothing there that the light and shadow wouldn't account for. Then the shape of it resolved, the way one of those images you have to stare at long enough before the second picture inside it appears. It was standing at the tree line where the hemlock thickened, partially occluded by the trunk of a large fir. And the first thing I understood about it was the scale. The head was above the level of the fir's lowest branch, which I'd passed under that morning without stooping. That branch was somewhere around 8 feet off the ground. The width at the shoulders was something I kept trying to measure against familiar things, and kept failing to, because the closest familiar thing I could find was the hood of a pickup truck. And that comparison didn't help me. The fur, if that's the right word, was very dark, closer to black than brown, and it moved slightly in the air coming off the slope, the way the fur on a large animal moves, not a costume, not a fixed surface. It was facing me. That was the other thing I understood. The head was angled toward me directly, and what I could see of the face in the shadow under the hemlock canopy was still and attentive in a way that I recognized, the way you recognize a quality you've seen in a working dog or a horse, an intelligence that is reading you as carefully as you are reading it. We stood there looking at each other across roughly 30 yards of trail corridor and fading October light, and I did not move, and it did not move. And Pepper sat down against my calf and leaned her small weight into my leg, and that was, I think, what kept me standing there instead of taking a step backward. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Long enough for the pewter in the sky to go darker and for the cold to settle a notch. Long enough for me to stop feeling afraid, if afraid is even the accurate word for what I'd felt at first, and to start feeling something that I can only describe as being in the presence of something very old that had very little interest in harming me and very clear interest in being seen by me. I know how that sounds. I'd always been the kind of man who needed a thing to make structural sense before he would give it credence, and this thing did not make structural sense, and I gave it credence anyway. At some point it turned slowly and without urgency, and moved into the hemlock. It moved with a quietness that was not the quietness of something trying to be quiet. It was the quietness of something that simply took up space differently than the things I was used to. One moment it was there, and then the timber had closed around it, and there was nothing at the tree line except the hemlock trunks and the grey light going down between them, and the birds in the canopy above continued to move and call without interruption. Pepper let out a slow breath against my knee. I stood there until I was sure that the light was going to continue failing and that I needed to be back at the truck before full dark. I walked the trail to the trailhead with my mallet over my shoulder and Pepper at my left heel, and I didn't say anything to myself or to her, and neither of us hurried. At the truck, I sat in the cab for a while with the heat running, and Pepper on the seat beside me with her head in my lap. The windows fogged over slowly, I had a thermos of coffee and I poured a cup and held it without drinking it for a long time. I picked up my phone. Clara's number was where it had always been, third from the top in my recent calls list, which was a small and strange form of evidence that I had been meaning to call for longer than I'd let myself acknowledge, because recent calls is not where you find a number you've never dialed. I must have opened the screen and looked at her name before, in the past 2 years, more than once, and then put the phone down. I didn't remember doing it, but the number was there. I called. It rang 4 times, and I was preparing myself for the voicemail message I'd heard twice before when she answered. Dad. Just that. Her voice was flat and careful, the voice of someone who has been carrying a long expectation. Clara, I said. I'm sorry I'm calling late. I'm out at the site. It's okay. A long pause. I could hear the ambient sound of wherever she was, something like a television in another room. I just wanted to, I don't know, check in. I'm working a contract up near Ridgemont, 6 weeks. Are you doing okay? I'm working, I said, which is better than not working. Another pause. I heard the television go off. I've been meaning to call, she said. Not accusatory, just true. I know, me too. This is what I have of that conversation. I know there was more of it, another few minutes at least, because by the time I hung up, the windows had fogged entirely and I had to run the defrost to see out. But what I remember is those first 2 minutes, the two of us finding each other's voices again the way you find a familiar tool in a dark barn, by feel. It was enough. It was a beginning, which was more than I'd had an hour before I'd called. I sat in the truck for another quarter of an hour, Pepper asleep now against my thigh. Then I started the engine and drove back to the camp trailer outside Ridgemont and cooked a can of soup and wrote up my field notes for the day. Under the date I wrote, Ponderosa Bridge in full use, well seated, cedar in place, no disturbance, east slope clear. Then I wrote Clara's name, and beneath that I wrote, answered, and I underlined it once. I finished the contract the week of Thanksgiving. The removal crew came in the 4th week and worked the prioritized trees, and by the time I completed my final documentation walk in late November, the east slope had opened up considerably, the light reaching the forest floor in the places where the dead ponderosa had stood. The felled tree was still in place across the washout. I documented it in my field notes as a natural windfall, which was not entirely accurate but was the closest available category. The trail crew supervisor mentioned it when we crossed paths at the end of the 5th week, said it was about the most convenient piece of natural infrastructure he'd seen, and they'd probably just leave it, maybe put a couple of rebar stakes through it to keep it from rolling once the bank dried out in summer. I told him that sounded like the right call. Ruth had known about the cedar sprigs before I did, I think. That sounds strange for me to say about a habit of my own, but what I mean is that she knew the kind of man I was, the one who would need a small daily gesture to anchor himself to a grief too large to look at directly, and she would have recognized the sprigs as exactly that kind of gesture. She would not have made a ceremony of knowing. She would have let me think it was private, the same way I'd let her think that I didn't notice every morning when she refilled the hummingbird feeder even in October when there were no hummingbirds, which she did every October for as long as I knew her, keeping the routine even when the reason for it had gone south for the winter. Clara came out to Ridgemont for the last 2 days of the contract. She drove up from Portland on a Friday afternoon, and she helped me break down the camp trailer and load my equipment into the truck bed. And on Saturday morning, we walked the trail together to trail post 7 for the last time. The morning was clear and cold, hard November blue above the ridgeline, the frost heavy in the grass along the trailhead. I cut a cedar sprig from the low branch where I'd been cutting them all 6 weeks, and we walked the trail in the cold, Pepper ranging ahead and then circling back to walk between us. Clara did not ask about the sprig. She walked beside me with her hands in her coat pockets, her breath coming in small clouds, and she looked at the ridge view from post 7 for a long time without speaking. I laid the cedar at the base of the post and straightened up, and stood there with my hands at my sides in the cold. "She sent me the same photograph," Clara said after a while. "She did?" "I still have it in my kitchen, on the refrigerator." I didn't say anything to that. We stood there a while longer in the November cold, the 3 ridgelines going pale and blue to the west, the way they always had, Pepper sitting at our feet with her nose pointed at the view as though she was reading it. Then we walked back down the trail together, the felled ponderosa still solid and bark smooth underfoot where we crossed the washout, and the morning light came in through the opened canopy on the east slope in long level bands, reaching the ground where it hadn't reached in years. I don't talk about what I saw at the tree line, not in a way that invites examination. Clara doesn't know, and I've thought about whether I'd tell her someday, and I come back to the same answer. Maybe, but not yet. What happened on that trail is mine to carry for now, and I find that the carrying is not the burden it was in the 2 years before. Something was out there in the Cascades foothills that October, in the hemlock and fir, moving through the timber on that east slope, with the quiet assurance of something that had made a long study of the territory and of me in it. I don't know what to call it. I know what it wasn't. It wasn't a bear, and it wasn't a man in any configuration of man I've ever encountered, and it wasn't the light or the fatigue or the way grief does things to your perception of the world when you've been carrying it alone long enough. I've considered each of those explanations fully, and I've set them aside with the same care I'd use to set aside a measurement that doesn't close. What I have instead of an explanation is this. Something in those trees noticed a ritual I was performing for a person who was gone, and it answered the ritual in the same language. And in doing so, it reminded me that caring for what you've lost is not the same thing as being done with the living. Pepper is asleep at my feet right now, which is where she usually is on cold evenings when the wood stove is running and the work of the day is finished. Her muzzle is going grey in a way that I try not to think about too carefully. Clara is coming for Christmas, the first time since Ruth died, that the house won't be just the 2 of us, me and Pepper, rattling around in the square footage of a life that used to hold more people. I put a fresh cedar sprig in a small jar of water on the kitchen windowsill a week ago. I don't know exactly why. Partly because the smell of cedar in the morning is a good thing to have in a house in winter. Partly because some habits, once you've let them form, become a part of the daily architecture of a life, and you don't have to justify an architecture to live inside it. The photograph Ruth sent me is on the windowsill too, leaning against the jar. The 3 ridgelines pale blue in the afternoon light, her handwriting on the back. You would have liked this one. She was right. I did.